Welcome back to Risky Business, a show about making better decisions. I'm Maria Konnikova, and today my co-host Nate Silver is gallivanting in Norway, I believe, and so I have an amazing guest co-host, an old dear friend of mine, brilliant writer, incredible thinker, David Epstein. David is the author of two international bestsellers, The Sports Gene and Range. Both are incredible, highly recommend, and a book that will be out inside the box, and we'll have him back on when that comes out. And I'm really glad to have him here today to talk about a topic that he knows a lot about. Today on the show, our first segment is going to be about genetics and designer babies and the ethics of it, the implications of it, kind of what kind of world we want to live in. And after that, we'll be talking about a different kind of determinism for what ends up happening to you in your life, which is, does your name matter? Welcome to the show, David. Thank you so much for being my co-host today.
Nate's loss, my gain. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, of course. All right, so first up, we're going to talk a little bit about genetics. So there is a new startup, Orchid, that's been in the news. The Orchid pitch is that, we can help you determine not just the risk of certain medical conditions that are already being tested for, but more conditions that up to now people haven't really been able to look at. And potentially in the future, and they never say this explicitly, we'll be able to go even further and look at genes and traits that have little to do with medical risk and more to do with what kind of a kid do you want. Orchid's clients include big names that we've all heard of, but are not officially confirmed, but a lot of them are among the elites of Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurs, people who are kind of the movers and shakers of the modern world. So first, David, what do you just think in general about the whole concept of being able to determine, you have tons of embryos and we can pick the ones that we want based on certain factors. And by the way, little caveat, people have been doing this in terms of disease for multiple years now, right? If we can test for a disease risk, if I have a family risk, for instance, of schizophrenia, something like that, we can try to mitigate that somehow. Schizophrenia was actually a really bad one to choose because that's a polygenic, very difficult one. But that's the general idea originally. As we have just said, this goes further. So what are your initial thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, in a very broad way, by the way, I think this gets an issue where everyone's talking about how AI is going to change our lives. And I've thought genetics and gene editing and genetic selection in the long term have the potential to more fundamentally change our lives than AI does. But I think the issue, I don't know a lot about Orchid. I mean, I looked at a very little bit about them specifically, so I don't know all the services they do, but obviously they're emphasizing the health stuff, which I think is a matter of degree difference from what people are already doing, right? People already screen for chromosomal abnormalities, Down syndrome being a familiar one, and then they have the choice of whether or not to do anything about that or not. Nobody's compelled. So to the extent that what they're doing is, it seems that they have a technology that allows them to amplify DNA really well. So they really, really early after conception, they can get a few cells, get a reliable DNA signal from it and screen for a whole bunch of potential diseases. So that I think is just a difference in degree of things that are already going on. And as someone who, I got off training to be a scientist and got into journalism because I was a competitive runner and had a training partner who died at the end of a race from a genetic condition. So the idea that we could prevent stuff from that, these genetic mutations that we know of that rip through families like a forest fire, I think that's a good option for parents to have. But I think there are a lot of more difficult questions, right? Like you mentioned polygenic traits. So a lot of the monogenic stuff is is easier in some cases. You see a genetic variant, it causes some disease. You can take it out, right? People, if someone, there may be moral questions about dispensing with the embryos, but that's the case for IVF in general, anyway. So I think the reason that this is pretty controversial, probably two reasons. One is that it will be much, like the people you mentioned, it will be wealthy people that adopt it, right? So then you have this question of, are we bifurcating the world into people who can prevent diseases in their children and people who can't because they have money. So that's one question. And that just feels icky, right? When it comes to health, like nobody feels, you don't feel as icky about wealthy people having nicer cars as you do about being able to be healthy. But then the kind of third rail, I think, is when you start selecting for things that are more traits than diseases, right? Like intelligence or athleticism or whatever it is. And in those cases, I think up to now, it hasn't been that feasible because those things, unlike some diseases, most things are not caused by one gene. Most things are caused by all sorts of parts of your DNA. Genes are the parts that code for specific proteins. And now we know like it may be every single gene and a bunch of other parts of your DNA that aren't even genes that interact to create like, even how tall you are. Maybe every single gene that has some influence in that, each one in a little way. And it hasn't been very feasible since we have no idea what most genes do to actually select for that stuff. But there's now some work where you do this thing called polygenic, like gene scores. We can have a huge database of a huge number of people and you've sequenced their genomes and you have their health information and you can kind of give them a score based on a large number of genes that you may not even know what those genes do. But this configuration looks like it might change someone's cognitive ability a little or their height a little bit or some other trait about them. And that's where you get into these things that are not preventing someone from dropping dead, but things that would just be nice to have or bigger advantages for your child. And so I think that's like the third rail, right?
Yep.
So I think the reason that it's so controversial is that people see it as like the first domino to fall en route to that, which is something that is now, even though I think if you selected for a lot of those polygenic traits, you'd only make a tiny difference. But if you do that generation after generation after generation, like that's how breeding works.
Yeah, no, for sure. That is exactly how breeding works. And I think you've raised a few really interesting points. One that we still we really don't know how this shit works a lot of the time, right? And sometimes you think that you might be selecting for something really, really good, but you are also it comes with a trade-off, right? That you just do not know about, right? Sometimes that's even true of diseases, right? There are some things that make you susceptible to one disease, but are protective against other things.
That's right.
And we don't actually know all of those genetic interactions.
That's right. I mean, a classic example, right, is that some of the genes that cause sickle cell trait and sickle cell anemia are protective against malaria, which is why people of recent West African descent have that condition a lot, even if they now live in the United States, for example.
Yeah, that was the one that I was thinking. That is a very classic one that we know, but now we know, right?
Right,
but we didn't know before.
Right.
So I think that's part of it, right? That a lot of this stuff is just incredibly complicated. But I do think that when someone is promising, okay, you know what, I'll make your kid smarter and more likely to be a star athlete and more likely to be Mozart or whatever it is, that they're ethical things on a few levels. One, there's the ethics of the promise, right? With something like schizophrenia, right? This was the example I used at the beginning. And I said, this is actually a very bad example because schizophrenia is something that is determined by so many different factors. We don't know really what causes it. And it's not going to manifest for 18 years, 19 years, 20 years. It usually happens in the late teens, early 20s. And so in the meantime, this company can be making claims that, oh, we're screening for these things, not actually be doing it successfully. And we have no way of knowing. So there's the ethics of promising something that you're not really sure about. But then also if we can, let's assume we can do that. I do think that there are concerns both with the haves and have-nots, but also with the I'm selecting now for blue eyes and blonde hair, and I want someone who's a little bit taller. And it's so funny to me, there are people who are now quoting Gattaca, the movie, as this wonderful thing, oh yeah, we're making Gattaca babies. I was like, that movie was not positive about this kind of technology. That was a dystopia. That is something that we absolutely don't want.
So that's like Salman Khan's book, Brave New Words, which is obviously referencing Brave New World, which I didn't really think of as kind of a good connotation for children and their schooling necessarily. Yeah,
that's not a book that I have very positive associations with in terms of the kind of future we want to be living in.
Totally. And I think, to your point, I don't want to compare this company in particular to 23andMe, but 23andMe, since I was writing a book about genetics, I signed up for a bunch of direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies in the early days before they were really FDA, before the FDA was really paying attention to them. So you could get all kinds of information. And I remember there'd be, say, it would say, am I allergic to gluten or something like that? And it would show some of my gene variations compared to the population. It would say, oh, well, people with your genotype are, your odds ratio is like 1.02 or something. You're like slightly more. So 1 would be if you have the same risk of getting this thing as a typical person. So you're slightly increased risk. And then a month later, they'd find some other associated gene variant. It would be like, well, now you're actually at slightly decreased risk. And then there'd be like 3 more found, and they'd be like, you're at elevated risk again, right? So there's this question of you don't know what a lot of stuff is doing. And so it was like depended when I checked in if I were at increased or decreased risk. And again, that was some pretty unsophisticated stuff. My motto for genetics is genetics more complicated than we thought. Because people used to think we'd have like 100,000 genes, and then it turned out we only have like 23,000, and onions have way more DNA than we do. So it was kind of disappointing. Like we're not that complicated.
Onions are smarter than we are.
Who would argue with that?
Yeah.
That's why so many people don't like them. They're just jealous.
I'm allergic to them. What does that say about my intelligence?
You're allergic to onions?
Yeah, I'm allergic to raw onions, all raw onions.
Wow.
I can't break them down. So onions, shallots, scallions, chives, and
you shouldn't
listeners,
say stuff like
this
that
is
in
genetic.
public. Your kryptonite is now like out on the internet.
I know,
onions.
I know. So this is genetic. This is actually something that you can look at in your genes, and my body doesn't have the enzyme that can break them down.
Okay.
So as soon as they're cooked, I can eat them, but in any raw form, I'll become incredibly sick. So this is potentially actually, bringing it back to our topic at hand, this is something that Orchid or whatever company could potentially test for. And then I might not exist because they'd be like, oh my God, onion allergy. No, we can't have this embryo
Might
in the
not. I mean, I
world.
think we can all agree that we would get rid of that embryo for an onion allergy, for goodness sake. Like,
Yeah,
this changes the
absolutely.
whole conversation if
It
they could
does.
pick that
It
up.
does. It does. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so I don't want to compare them because I think some of the disease stuff I think is just a more powerful version of things that people are already doing. And by the way, I mean, I guess that's true to some degree for genetic selection. Like I wrote an article years ago about height in sports for ESPN. And, I was like, it turned out that almost every sperm donation clinic, like I couldn't donate because I'm not tall enough, right? I was a Division I athlete and all this stuff, did well
That's
in school.
insane. Wait, are you
Yeah,
serious?
Yeah, absolutely. But so it's like when push comes to shove, people do this stuff, right? And so I guess the question is, if it becomes widespread though, that's
the thing. Well,
different.
It's interesting that you say when push comes to shove because people do already so I don't have kids. I've never gone through IVF, fertility treatments, etc. But if I were to do that and I was looking for a sperm donor, I could go through binders, of backgrounds of people and choose who I would want, right? Yeah. And it would say things like, height and eye color and all of these things, where you went to school, so I could be like, I want someone smart. I want someone from the Ivy League.
Did you look at I'm sure in your college newspaper, there were advertisements for egg donors like crazy, right?
Absolutely.
And it would say and they would advertise in like the Harvard Crimson for a reason, right?
Yeah. Oh no, I was hit up for egg donations so many times.
But they didn't know that you were allergic to onions.
They did not. They did not know. Maybe the two, they don't balance out, do they? The onion allergy is much worse.
Yeah.
I understand. Damn. But yeah, that is absolutely true. And you could make a lot of money, right? By being an egg donor like that. Sperm donors don't make that much. Egg donors make a lot of money.
Can't imagine why, but unfair. Pay gap. This pay gap needs to be addressed.
Yes, gender pay gap for sure. So these types of things have been available in some way, shape, or form for a long time. But I do think that, if this becomes the norm, then it becomes problematic in many respects. And one other issue that we haven't talked about that people have raised is if this becomes the norm, right? And then people who don't actually have fertility issues, who don't need IVF, end up doing this so that they are not kind of the same way that people opt sometimes to have C-sections when they don't need them because they don't want to give vaginal birth, right? If people then make that choice just simply because they want that selection, that is also kind of an interesting ethical area, and has repercussions for a lot of society in the sense that, so Orchid, and we're not picking on Orchid, it just happens to be one that is like
Sure. It's
in
just
the news.
topical
right.
for the issue.
Exactly. So, but Orchid specifically charges $2,500 per embryo. Now, you'd need to make multiple embryos, and it can become much more expensive if you want other testing, et cetera, et cetera. So there is kind of there are more issues that keep piling up here.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think that it is particularly difficult to envision a scenario where IVF becomes like basically the norm because you want to be able to do embryo selection, right? I'm not saying that I think there'd ever be an instance, well, at least in the foreseeable future, that where everybody would make that choice, because there are a lot of different, obviously, ethical considerations. But I don't think it's that hard to see that. And I think you could end up in a kind of collective trap where, because some people are doing it, you know, and if it turns into real advantage, maybe there's pressure for insurance companies to then cover it, or you know, just for moral reasons, like it shouldn't be limited access. So I actually don't know which way we're going to go, but I don't think it's like sci-fi to imagine that IVF would become like the standard mode of procreation.
Yeah, and people say, you know, oh, but it's still a personal choice. Well, what you said about pressure, kind of peer pressure to do it, I think is actually huge. So when I just graduated from college, moved to New York, wanted to be a writer, it's really hard to make a living as a writer. You don't make a lot of money. So I tutored. I did a lot of private tutoring for very wealthy families. And, you know, that becomes something that, like, if you don't do it, right, you are disadvantaging your child and you're a bad parent. At that point, everyone expects that, like, oh, well, you'll get tutoring in all of these. You'll get SAT prep. You'll get this. You'll get that. And if you're one of the people who don't get it, then you're like, oh, my parents don't care enough, right, that they're not giving me that extra step. Now, by the way, I never got any sort of tutoring when I was a kid. I didn't get SAT prep or anything like that. But I was shocked at the fact that some of the kids really did need it, and others, like, it was just something that I was being paid basically to act as a tutor and to kind of be a tutor. When technically I was like, this is a smart kid who could do this by themselves, but no, because this is something you're required to do. And so I think that people might feel pressure to select, even if we don't know if it works, right? Just on the off chance that it might work, and that this sort of stuff might be testable, and that you might be giving your kids minute advantages. Now, one of the themes of risky business is that minute advantages matter, right? Small percentages matter. As a poker player, you know that if you get an extra 1% edge, that's huge. Mm-hmm. So even if we know that things like intelligence, you know, things like height, that they're determined by so many different variables, that nothing is, well, with few exceptions, nothing is all genetics, like one gene. And even if you can eke out an extra percentage point, right, an extra tiny bit for your kid, that could be huge. And are you negligent if you don't make that choice? If you say, you know what, I just want to have sex and just see what happens.
So quaint. Yes, I think, you know, like parental neuroses is like a bottomless well of spending, right? So there's a lot of business opportunities there. But I do think there is now, and I wouldn't have said this not that long ago, that there's real reason to believe that some of these traits could be accurately selected for in a small way. Again, that doesn't say anything about, are you accidentally then getting something you don't want, right? There's a lot of unknowns. Right. But I think for the first time, some of these other non-disease traits, we could load the dice a little bit, and then over multiple generations that could become more and more and more. But again, I think those are separate from the issue of making the screening for disease better much earlier and more extensive.
Yeah. No, I think that just to put this out there, I think that the screening for disease is great. You know, I think that's a very good thing. I think that, you know, I
don't know that everyone would agree with that, right?
Because maybe not.
You're still like selecting for embryo.
For sure. Oh, for sure. No,
so
I actually
think that's less controversial, but I bet
I think that a lot of people won't agree with that. Yeah. Because they don't think you should be able to select for anything. But, you know, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. Ashkenazi Jews, have predilections, you know, for a lot of different genetic conditions. You know, if we can reduce Tay-Sachs, right? If we can reduce Huntington's, if we can reduce the risk of some of these, really devastating conditions.
Totally deadly,
yeah, that would be amazing, right? I think personally. Related to this, we also do have emerging technologies, CRISPR, that can edit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that it's slightly different, right? You're not choosing embryos, but we have technology that is becoming better and better where we can actually go into the genome and say, okay, snip, snip, let's try to fix this.
Yeah.
And let's try to, not literally, by the way, people, you don't actually go in with scissors, but
It's not that different though. That's a pretty good analogy.
but so we have technologies like that, that don't require IVF. So I think that it's those, it's interesting. Like it's very, very complicated because there are certain things about this that I think are amazing. There are certain things that really give me pause. And then there are things I actually am kind of scared of the unknowns. And I know that, yes, we shouldn't be afraid of a technology because we don't know the side effects. But, there are certain things like maybe when you are trying to kind of control for the schizophrenia cluster genes, you're also getting rid of artistic talent just because I say that as a cliched thing that often goes together. But like maybe we're actually getting rid of some good things and some natural variation mutations that we have no idea what they do. And they might have existed in this embryo and we just will never know.
That's an interesting point on two counts. One, I mean, we know there are things like to give a sort of extreme example. Years ago, this was with earlier forms of gene therapy, but there were some tests on boys with what I think it's called X-linked combined immunodeficiency syndrome. People commonly know it as bubble boy syndrome because the boy has, so it's linked to an X chromosome, and because boys only have one, there's not another copy to correct it. So some X-linked diseases are in boys. And so bubble boy syndrome, meaning they basically have no immune system, so they can't go anywhere. They have to live in a bubble. And gene therapy, this was a more rudimentary form. It wasn't CRISPR like gene editing, but using a gene created in the lab and it gets shuttled into the cells with a deactivated virus, basically. It cured some of them, which is incredible, right? But then a number of them got leukemia. So there was this incredible cure, but also this incredibly devastating effect. And so you don't know, right, some of the stuff that's going on. And to your point about that example you mentioned, schizophrenia and artistic talent, I think there have been some studies showing that you don't want mental illness to be creative, right? Because that incapacitates you in all these ways. But that tends to be more in the family of people who are extremely creative. And it's if there's all these genes that have a small effect, some people will have too many of them and they'll have mental illness. And some people have a bunch of them that make you kind of an unusual thinker, but not so many that you're incapacitated. I remember some years ago, after I wrote about genetics, a psychiatrist who served Harvard students coming to me and saying they definitely are overrepresented in all these conditions that are borderline mental illness, So you and your peers, it's not just your onion allergies, you're weird in other ways that might also be useful.
This also happens obviously with new drugs. For instance, you were saying the bubble boy, they end up dying of leukemia. We know that there were some drugs that showed amazing promise, right? And then ended up devastating your liver and kidneys and you die, right? Or something like that where oops, we had no idea, or, causes horrific birth defects or whatever it is. Those types of horrible moments, unfortunately, are all too common in medical history. But I think the difference there is you were trying to cure a person who was incredibly sick. Yeah. And here you have someone who's healthy and potentially in the future, someone who is perfectly fertile, doesn't need IVF, doesn't need any of this, and is choosing to do something which might then introduce these sorts of downstream effects.
That's a whole, it's like a saying among doctors that's it's very hard to make an asymptomatic patient better. There are cases where that's true, where you catch stuff ahead of time, but as a general rule, if someone doesn't need medical intervention, it's usually better to avoid medical intervention. So I think you're hitting on an important point. I mean, I wonder, what do you think? Let's say, because we've talked about how there may be sort of off-target effects that you don't want when you do some of this stuff. Let's say we get it all figured out, someday.
Yep.
I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get it all figured out because, as you alluded, this is this complex interplay between all these environmental stimulus and genetics. So there's no, like, to the extent that no two lives are the same, we're not going to have it all figured
Right.
out. But theoretically, if we did, and then it's just a matter of selecting for stuff you want, the way that you would with like a
Yeah.
dog breed. What then? Like then it's like just a
That's
kind of
scary.
how do we want society to
Yeah.
be question, right?
And that is quite dystopian if we also consider that it might be, if we pair that with what you said at the beginning, right? The divide between the haves and have-nots, where some people can afford this like state-of-the-art technology and others can't. And so we have a very specific type of person selecting for what they want. And yeah, to me, like that is dystopian, and that's kind of frightening because we know from psychology that people will, select people who are like them quite often, right? We like people who look like us. And it becomes, eugenics is a bad word for a reason, but it becomes very eugenics-like, where you are saying, these traits are inherently superior. But even, I'm actually curious from your standpoint of someone who was a Division I athlete, who knows a lot about sports, like even with, sports genes and things that we know are really cool mutations. There's sometimes like you will find an athlete who doesn't look like other athletes who ends up being the best, or who ends up discovering kind of a new way of doing something that absolutely changes a sport or a way of competing. And are we also, like, when we select for kind of this one ideal that whoever has in their mind, are we potentially homogenizing society to the point where those types of breakthroughs are actually going to become quite rare if they happen at all?
Yeah, I mean, like variation is necessary for like both natural selection to happen, but I think also artificial selection, or whatever you want to call it. And I mean, maybe artificial selection is not the right word, but for new stuff, like new ideas and all those things. So I think that's way, way down the road because there's a ton of variation. But if we really start going down this path, then I think those are things to think about way ahead of time. And you can imagine, I think it's already like troubling enough, some of the ideals of perfection that you have on Instagram.
Yeah.
And so if that's then being applied to like all the genomes, I think you have to start asking questions of like, maybe there are things where we could be better at certain things we know about, but how do we want life to be? I think that's an important question with technology that should be asked. Like I like innovation. I think invention technology is like really cool. I started playing with AI immediately as soon as I could. At the same time, I don't think, we should always just forge ahead on everything without asking like, how do we want life to be and unfold? Right.
Yeah. I think that's really important. And I will just add one last thing to that, which is that we're also ignoring a potentially huge mental health crisis if this ends up happening. How do we want life to be? Well, what happens if you're a designer baby that your parents selected these certain things for, and you feel like you would have liked to be something else? You feel like things were chosen for you. I mean, I think that from a psychology standpoint, there might be a lot of issues with that, and we might have kind of a crisis in the generations of children who are subjected to this. So yeah, a lot of things to think about. This is a really, really complicated thing. I think that this is, it's a really morally, ethically, medically, just every single level complicated topic. And I think something that people should really give a lot of thought to for the long term, because, as with so much technology, just because we can doesn't mean we should.
No, and,
right?
And like people, I think it's been pretty good. The discussion about AI has been vibrant, and the potential positives and the potential negatives, the ethical concerns, et cetera, what we want the future to look like. Again, I think genetic technology in the long term has a potentially much larger impact than AI does on fundamental aspects of our life. And those conversations have been kind of one note. It's every once in a while something like Orchid pops up and there's a discussion, but I don't think it's been diverse and constant to the extent that it has with AI, even though I think it's at least equally as important.
Yeah, I think that this is very important note of caution and also call to action, that these conversations are important and need to be had. David, for a number of years, you and I have been exchanging text messages about names that we come up with, that we see in the news and that make us both giggle, because they are examples of nominative determinism, which is a psychology concept which means that your name doesn't just matter, but is in some ways deterministic. It determines your career path or...
Move over genes.
Move over genes. It's not the genes that matter, it's the name that matters. And, the most simplistic example is something like someone with the last name Baker is going to go on to become a baker. And this would be, a hilarious joke if it didn't happen so incredibly often. And some people take it a little bit further. Like they'll say, oh, well, it's just the first letter that matters. So like if your name is Lindsay, you're more likely to become a lawyer. I'm like, yeah, no, I don't think so. So there are people who take it to an extreme. But basically the idea is your name matters more than you think.
Yes. And so people have funny names that are associated with their jobs. And I think the idea, well, before we get to the idea of if there's any like real psychology behind this, I have a quiz for you if you're willing to take it.
All right, let's do it.
I went back through some old of my favorites. I don't think I've told you these ones. You may know them because you're an enthusiast, a collector, a connoisseur, a collector of names, as am I. So I'm going to give you the name, and you're going to tell me their job. Okay?
Okay. Sounds good.
Bert Beveridge.
He works in the beverage industry.
Created Tito's vodka. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, big. Okay.
Tito's creator's last name is Beveridge?
Bert Beveridge.
I did not know this.
I tell you. Okay, I've got some more for you. Okay. Keith Weed. This one has a bonus. Keith Weed.
Does Keith Weed work in the pot business?
Head of the Royal Horticultural Society. Oh. Mother's maiden name, Hedges.
Oh no!
Double layer.
No.
Double layer.
Okay, so I went the wrong kind of weed, but this one also works.
You were in the plant.
I was, yeah.
Joshua Butt. Come on.
Is he a fitness trainer, coach?
I love that you guessed that. Gastroenterologist, but should be a fitness trainer. All right. Sue Yu.
Lawyer.
Yes, correct.
Prosecutor, probably.
Sue Yu. Lieutenant Les McBurney. We may have done this.
Yes, Les McBurney is a firefighter. That one you and I did together.
Okay. Last one. This one kind of up your alley. Walter Russell Brain, otherwise known as the Right Honorable Lord Brain.
Is he a psychologist?
The world famous neurologist. Close enough.
Neurologist.
We'll get a score for that one. Those are some good ones.
Those are some good ones. Well, I'll give you a few that you and I have talked about recently. One of my favorites that I think you said that it was a hoax, and I had to look up the whole biography to make sure it wasn't. Nick Burns Cox. He is a urologist, and he invented something that is called the pee in pot.
That's like a little too on point.
Right?
We had a doctor recently.
We did have a doctor, and I thought that was very funny. Now that we've entertained you with some of our famously funny names, the question is there actually anything to this? And so the science on it is all over the place. Like, this is a hard thing to study because even though there are these hilarious examples, like there are billions of people in the world, right?
Right. What's the chances there wouldn't be a doctor?
And what's the chance that there wouldn't be a urologist whose last name was Burns Cox?
That, I think the chances are very high that wouldn't happen. I'm glad we live in this one of the multiverse where we got Dr. Burns Cox.
But yeah, and we also have base rate stuff. So like if your last name is Baker, like, and you happen to be in the baking industry, like, come on, how many bakers are there? Like, so there are lots of confounding factors, and it's not like people have looked at lists of every single profession, every single name in the world and tried to do any sort of comprehensive study. So all of the data I could find, some find evidence of it, some don't. I think it's a wash, right? Like, I don't think that there's hugely strong evidence for it, But on the other hand,
It
right?
being that these people are actually more likely to go into professions associated with their name. Yeah.
Exactly. But on the other hand, there are some reasons to believe that this would be a thing. So, for instance, if your last name is Baker, like chances are you are descended from a family of bakers because, there is, and this is true not just in English. So in the Russian language, this is true of last names. And I know in a lot of different cultures, this is true. Names were given to families based on the family's profession.
Like the causality is running in the other direction.
Exactly. So carpenter, was a family of carpenters. And it's really interesting because we were just, we were talking about genetics. And so if you are in a family that was in a certain kind of craft, so to speak, then you might have a genetic predisposition for it, a talent for it, et cetera, et cetera. So then exactly, it's reverse causality that you were named this, you still have a family name because it's something that your family has been good at for multiple generations.
And what do you think about, I don't know, I've never really done a deep dive in this literature because I just desperately want it to be true. And so,
that's fair. I don't think you should.
But what do you think about the idea? I mean, I seem to recall when I read a little bit about it that the theory was that people are like, one, just more aware of jobs that might be related to their name, or people tell them like, oh, you should be, Sue you, oh, you should be a lawyer. Or they're like more positively disposed to those things because kind of people like things with their names on them, right? Like that's why Coke puts people's names on a bottle. You're like, I see my name, I like it. And then maybe they have like a little more positive association with some of those professions if it feels like related to their name. Like they find it fun just like we do.
Oh, I think there's actually evidence for all of these things because that does happen all the time, right? Like people do say, oh, you should do X or Y if you have a funny name, if you have a memorable name.
Yeah. So like as crazy as it sounds, there's some actually like not very insane theories for like why like maybe there's some reality. It's just like more salient to you.
And as we've talked about with genetics, what kinds of traits are you more likely to select for? You do tend to gravitate to things that are familiar, right? And that are comfortable, that remind you of your parents, of people and these sorts of biases manifest themselves incredibly early on, right? We're talking infants, right, that are 10 months old already show some of these preferences for faces that are same skin color as their parents. It's not something that happens at birth, but it does actually start manifesting incredibly early just because, it is familiar, right? It is what you know. And so if you do have a name that is Coxburns, then maybe, you end up subconsciously, consciously, on some level, thinking more about those types of things. Maybe if your last name is Judge, you're like, haha, wouldn't it be funny if my name was Judge? Or, if I'm Doctor, or something like that. So, on the one hand, this is just hilarious and it seems like an artifact and we collect these funny names. On the other hand, there are both psychological and historical reasons why this effect might actually be an effect. And obviously it's weak, right? And like with anything, things are multiply determined. And it's not like, you end up doing something just because of this one thing.
Yeah.
And you might have a last name that's incredibly salient and yet do nothing with that.
Yeah.
My last name in Russian, by the way, is related to horses. And I'm allergic to horses. So, I'm definitely not going to be doing anything in that area.
It ends with you, the horse line. I was thinking of there was a great Russian hurdler named Maria Stepanova, which sounds like step on over, like a hurdler.
Yeah.
But I don't know what it means in Russian, so that probably wouldn't be
it
very
means
much
of Stephen.
Of Stephen, okay. Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting, and it's a silly thing, but like, I wonder what the effect size is for some. Like, if you want your kid to be a judge, or let's say a lawyer, what can Orchid do for you, or a genetic testing company if you want them to be a lawyer, versus naming them Sue you? It's like, I wonder which has a bigger effect size.
Or small. Justice Epstein.
That's right. Yeah. Totally. Yeah, I wonder if the effect carries if you're sort of named for someone too, right? Because then you'd have those associations. Like being
And
named for some prominent person.
for sure, for sure. And I'm thinking now back to kind of early colonial days, right? Think of the names, like think of your early US history, where people were named virtues or things that that you wanted them to exhibit, chastity or virtue, grace, like all of these absolutely, crazy names. Some of them are just absolutely temperance. These names that just sound completely insane to us now, but I think that was one of the reasons they thought that maybe if that's your name and you're constantly temperance, are you sure you want another drink? Temperance.
I feel like that could go either way. They could be like, my parents named me Temperance, so I'm going off the rails. Like, forget them.
Yeah. And as I casually mentioned at the beginning, base rates are also important here, right? If we're looking at this, you need to look at it from a statistically savvy, as opposed to kind of this name just stands out more, right? So I gravitate toward it and I pick and choose the ones that I say, see, nominative determinism. So I think that's important. And that's an analysis that's really hard to do because where are you going to get those data sets?
Yeah.
Right. Like,
you can't really randomize people to life, and give them different names and see how things turn out.
Right. That would be funny.
Yeah. So basically the bottom line is I'm just going to continue to believe that it's completely deterministic and text you every hilarious name that I see in the news.
And I will laugh every time, and I will text you back other hilarious names. For now, we can just keep on thinking this is funny. For anyone listening and wanting tips on whether what they name their kid matters, yes, it does, but please don't name your kid Temperance. That will probably backfire. Yeah. That's probably not what we're going for.
Name them YouTuber instead.
Yes, exactly. Influencer.
Works every time.
TikTok star. I'm actually officially changing my name to TikTok star.
I feel like there's a strong chance this has already happened. So I have a son, and when we were naming, I downloaded a bunch of data from the Social Security Administration on naming, and I think it was they gave you every name that was used at least, I don't know, 3 times or 5 times, whatever it was. They didn't include in the data names that were only used once. And so the names that were used the least, but 3 or 5 times, were literally someone hitting their head on a keyboard. And those were used 3 to 5 times in a given year. So there's for sure somebody has been named TikTok.
Well, apparently there is a baby that was born this year who was named after ChatGPT. So it's a baby girl, and her name is ChatGPT. It's a Colombian baby. So
seriously,
we are, yes.
Is seriously. This angling for an endorsement or just a technological enthusiasm, or what's going on there?
I'm not sure, but on August 15th, ChatGPT Bastidas Guerra was registered at the local national registry.
Have they used GPT-5 though? I don't really like it that much. Maybe they should rename the baby Claude or something.
Or Anthropic, yeah. For the company, you can
Perplexity,
Gemini. Yeah.
Those are actually all better names than...
But what if Gemini isn't a Gemini? I mean, that's going to be incredibly
There's a lot of
confusing.
considerations. This is a serious business.
Yeah, this is a serious business. So listeners, please choose wisely before choosing a name. But yeah, this is something that I will continue looking at the literature and see if any interesting studies come out, because I can't help but feel that there might be something to this, right? Because there are so many reasons why, and because there are some data sets that show that yes, there is kind of some sort of an effect.
And it's interesting. It's an interesting mix. Usually when you hear something kind of ridiculous, it's probably not true in psychology. In this case, behind this ridiculous thing, there are actually some pretty sort of almost common sense, someone's just more aware of this profession, or people say, oh, you should do this, you should look at that, right?
Yeah.
Which is not that hard to understand.
So there you have it, people. Whether it's genetics or names, today's episode is all about things that determine your future and the future of the world. Thanks so much for being such an amazing co-host, David. I hope you will come back both as a guest and as a guest co-host when Nate inevitably ends up in Norway and can't host the show.
I would love to.